September 21, 2025, Luneta Park, Manila. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos are in the streets. They're angry, they're loud, and they are there for a very specific reason. Billions of pesos meant for flood control projects had disappeared. Ghost projects, money that was supposed to protect communities from drowning, now gone. Into whose pockets? I think we can all guess. So the signs are serious. The chants are serious. The energy is serious. And then in the middle of all of it, there's this flag. A black flag, a skull, wearing a straw hat. The Jolly Roger of the Straw Hat Pirates from One Piece. Now, if you're not an anime fan, your first reaction might be, okay, what? Why is someone waving a cartoon pirate flag at a corruption protest? And if you are an anime fan, you know exactly why. This video is for both of you. Because what happened at the Trillion Peso March wasn't random, it wasn't a joke, it was the result of almost 30 years of a story that, whether we realized it or not, was preparing an entire generation of Filipinos for this exact moment. Let me tell you about One Piece. It's a manga series created by Eiichiro Oda in 1997. It became an anime in 1999, and at its center is this guy, Monkey D. Luffy, rubber body, red vest, straw hat, and one dream: to become the king of the pirates. On the surface, it sounds like a straightforward adventure story, and it is, but it's also something else entirely, because the world of One Piece is not a fair world. It's run by an organization called the World Government, a global power structure that presents itself as the protector of peace and order, but underneath that image, it's rotten. It rewrites history to protect itself. It silences anyone who speaks the truth. It sacrifices the lives of ordinary people. For what? To keep the people at the top comfortable? To keep the people at the top untouchable? Now Luffy doesn't bow to any of it. Not because he's trying to be revolutionary, not because he has this political agenda, but because when he sees something being hurt by a system that was never built for them, he just refuses to accept it. He fights every single time, and he doesn't fight alone. He builds a crew made of people who were broken, rejected, and forgotten by the world, by this system. Some people who lost their dream, some thief who was robbed of her childhood, a liar who no one believed, all of them brought together not by power or strategy, but by the simple fact that someone looked at them and said, "You belong somewhere. Come with me." That's the story. That's part of what's on the flag. Now, in terms of reach, One Piece is not small. As of 2022, it holds the Guinness World Record for the most copies published of any comic series by a single author. Over 500 million copies in circulation worldwide, and the Netflix live-action adaptation in 2023 brought in millions of new fans globally. Here in the Philippines, One Piece has been airing on GMA since the early 2000s. It's been dubbed in Filipino. Generations of kids grew up watching it on Saturday mornings. There's conventions, fan clubs, cosplay events, One Piece themed fun runs with over 8,000 participants. This is not niche. This is Filipino pop culture. This is part of how we grew up if you open your eyes. The One Piece flag at the Trillion Peso March didn't appear out of nowhere. It had already been around the world before it got to us. It was in Indonesia, July 2025. Young Indonesians fed up with the economic hardship, fed up with the government they felt wasn't listening, began flying the Straw Hats Jolly Roger at protests. Some flew it instead of the national flag in the lead up to Independence Day. Indonesian lawmakers called it treasonous. They warned people to stop, which of course made it spread faster, because here's the thing about protest symbols, and this is something researchers at the ICEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore have written about directly. Eugene Mark and Panarat Anamwatana, in their analysis of the Indonesian protests, observe that suppression tends to strengthen symbols. Now, when a government tries to take a symbol away from the people, that symbol becomes more powerful, not less. It becomes proof of exactly what the protesters were saying, that those in power are afraid of what ordinary people represent when they stand together. So the flag kept moving. In Nepal, young protesters waved it as they marched against a government they called corrupt and unresponsive. Protests that ultimately led to the collapse of the government. The flag was draped on the gates of the parliament. France, anti-government protests. The flag appeared on the streets of Paris, Morocco, Madagascar, East Timor, Slovakia. Everywhere young people were angry and came together. The Straw Hat Jolly Roger showed up. September 21, 2025, it came to Manila. At the Trillion Peso March, environmental activist Jonila Castro said something that I think captures the whole moment. She said, "While we are sinking in flood water and mud, they are drowning in money they stole from the people." That's what the flag was flying for. That's what it meant on those streets. Vendors even selling straw hats at the rally, the same kind that Monkey D. Luffy wears in the anime. For what? In solidarity with the marchers. A fictional pirate hat, a fictional flag at a real protest about real stolen money in real life in our country. So the question I want to sit with for a moment is, why this story? Out of everything in pop culture, why did young people in Asia beyond reach for the One Piece flag? Nuriyanati Jali, an assistant professor affiliated with the Institute of South Asian Studies, put it simply in an interview with NPR. She said, "What makes One Piece so powerful in protest is really the story at its core. It is about a group of misfits, outsiders, rebels, people who do not fit the system coming together. That narrative translates across borders, whether you're in Asia, Africa, or elsewhere." And she's not wrong, but I want to go a little deeper because I think there's something very specific happening here that goes beyond just, it's a good story about rebels. Henry Jenkins, one of the most widely cited media scholars in the world, a professor at USC and the author of Convergence Culture, has argued that heroic narratives from popular media often surface in political moments because this gives young people the optimism, the resilience, and the sense of empowerment they need to participate in civic life. Think about what that means. That's not the young people who are confused about the difference between fiction and reality. It's just that the fiction gives them a model, a prototype for what courage looks like. And when the real world asks them to be courageous, of course, they reach for models they already have. For an entire generation of Filipinos, one of those models is Monkey D. Luffy. And when you look at the specific reasons protesters said they connected with the flag, it gets even clearer. One protester named Nico, interviewed at Mendiola by the Manila Bulletin, said this: "We relate to him because we saw how he continued to fight for what is right and just for the people despite being lesser in power than his enemies. We saw that even though they were a small group, they were able to unite other people around a common goal." That's not someone being naive. That's someone who understands exactly what the story is about. And they're putting it to use. This is exactly what applies to their situation. Another protester, 28-year-old Baste, talked about joining the March for Sun's Future, and he said something that I kept coming back to. He said, "These fictional characters taught me something that I did not expect would be a factor on how I perceive society as a whole and on what kind of world I would like my son to grow up in." Fiction shaped how he sees the world. Fiction made him care enough to show up. Fiction, in a very real sense, made him a more engaged citizen. This is not a small thing. Now, let me be direct, because I think this is the most important part. Why is One Piece relevant to Filipinos? Not because it's popular, though it is, not because it's well made, though it very much is, but because it is genuinely, deeply ours in a way that a lot of people underestimate. One Piece didn't arrive in the Philippines as a foreign piece of entertainment that we passively consumed. It grew up with us. It was dubbed in our language, aired in our televisions, became part of the fabric of how entire generations of Filipinos understand friendship, loyalty, sacrifice, and the idea that every ordinary person can matter. Research on the impact of Japanese pop culture on Filipino youth consistently shows that anime, and One Piece specifically, has shaped the value of identity of young Filipinos in meaningful ways. The sense of community, the loyalty to your barkada, the idea that you fight for the people beside you, not just for yourself. These are not foreign concepts imported from Japan. These just mapped perfectly onto Filipino values that we already hold. Bayanihan, pakikisama, lakas ng loob. Luffy doesn't feel like a foreign hero to Filipino audiences. He feels like one of us. But the September 21 flag adds something new and urgent to that conversation. Scholars studying how anime was used in 2019 Hong Kong protest, published in the Journal of Anime and Manga Studies, found that anime had become, and I'm paraphrasing here, not just entertainment but a transnational language for protest. A way for young people to communicate across borders, to build solidarity even across different cultures and different languages, united by a shared reference, by shared values. What happened at the Trillion Peso March fits that pattern exactly. Gen Z Filipinos, they just watched One Piece. They activated it. They took something they had loved since childhood and turned it into a tool for demanding accountability from their government, who probably knows what the flag means too. And that brings me to the second question: why is it important for Filipinos to engage with this piece of pop culture? Because One Piece teaches something that this country needs to hear over and over and over and over again in every generation. It teaches that the powerful depend on your silence. They depend on you believing that things can't change, that resistance is pointless, that the system is too big and too entrenched for ordinary people to affect. I mean, Luffy's entire existence is an argument against that, not because he always wins cleanly, but because he doesn't. He loses, he gets hurt, he cries. One of the most popular moments is his biggest loss. There are moments where everything falls apart, but he never ever accepts the situation is permanent. He never accepts that the people hurting others should be allowed to keep doing it. In a country with a long, painful history of corruption, of normalized suffering, of people being told to toughen up and accept things how they are, that this is not just a feel-good message. This is honestly resistance training. This is what it looks like to practice through fiction the kind of moral courage that real life will eventually ask of you. And on September 21, 2025, hundreds of Filipinos showed up at Luneta Park and proved that the practice had worked. A skull in a straw hat at Luneta Park. I want you to think about what it took for that image to exist. It took Eiichiro Oda sitting down in 1997 and deciding to write a story about people who refused to give up in the face of a cold system. It took JMA airing it on Saturday morning so Filipinos could watch. It took generations of young Filipinos to carry those stories inside them for years. Generations of young people throughout the world. Through school, through disappointment, through a pandemic, through watching their country struggle with the same problems it had always struggled with from the top down. And then it took one of them saying, you know what? I'm going to bring this flag. That's how pop culture works. At its best, that's how pop culture works. It shouldn't just entertain you, it should inform you. It gives you language for things you don't have the words for. It makes you feel less alone in wanting something better. Sometimes it hands you a symbol that says everything you need to say without a single word. The protesters at the Trillion Peso March were not playing pretend. They were not being childish. They were doing something that humans have done for as long as we've told stories. They were reaching for a myth that was passed down, that felt true, and is using it to face something real. It's been happening since the beginning of humans' existence. Eiichiro Oda wrote a story about pirates looking for treasure. The Philippines and the Filipinos who waved that flag were looking for something else. They were looking for a country worth keeping, and at the core of that story, it's the same thing. And I think that's worth fighting for. I mean, we're worth fighting for.